Most of us know that one very outdoorsy guy. It's that friend who implores you to go to the mountains or hike in the woods and enjoy the fresh air. You may gladly say yes to his suggestions, or you may require a bit of begging. But all in all, outdoor activities are one of the best ways to relax and unwind. Possibly, that's what a group of 7 tourists who decided to climb the Kamar Daban mountain range thought too. It was an innocent hike until group members started gasping for air, bleeding from their ears and nose, and hitting their heads against the rocks. In this video, we will tell you a story that remains one of the biggest enigmas among similar incidents. If you like scary stories and are interested in the shady past of the USSR, then you've probably heard of the Dyatlov Pass mystery. Then, in 1959, 9 hikers took part in an expedition. All of them died. Their deaths caused public resonance, not only because of the number of victims, but also because of the confusing crime scene and unscrupulous investigative actions that were inconsistent with the evidence. All of this became fertile ground for various conspiracy theories. But an even more bone-chilling and tragic story happened 30 years later in Buryatia on the Kamar Daban Pass. In 1993, in the vicinity of Retransliator Peak, Mount Treetrans, an entire tourist group but a few members lost their lives. There are few answers in this case, and the only survivor, a 17-year-old girl named Valya, refused to talk about the traumatic event ever since she first filed a report to the police in 1993. 41-year-old Lyudmila Korovina was an experienced tour instructor and survivalist. Peers and students called her Master, not only for her skills but also because of her Master of Sport of the USSR title. The woman was known for her tough love approach to her students. She put pressure on children often, but Lyudmila's students described her as a good teacher. After all, the wilderness and mountains are no place for wimps. Lyudmila's students prepared for her trip with her, and the woman was very close to all of them. The first of the 6, and closest to Lyudmila, was 20-year-old Alexander Sasha Krysin. Lyudmila had known Sasha for most of his life and treated him almost like her own son. The other 5 students were 24-year-old Tatiana Filipenko, 19-year-old Denis Shvachkin, 17-year-old Valentina Valya Utochenko, 16-year-old Victoria Zalasova, and 15-year-old Timur Bapanov. Group members were not close friends, but as members of the tourism club, or tourism enthusiasts, they knew each other very well. In 1992, they all went hiking in the Tian Shan Mountains as a group of almost identical makeup. So, since they had been on treks together and knew each other, could they have thought of this trip as the last in their lives? On August 2, 1993, a group of 7 tourists arrived at the mountain range in the town of Marino. The teenagers were anxious about their mountain trip, but the weather forecast promised them clear, sunny skies. In addition, as we've mentioned before, this area was popular among tourists in the summer and was thought to be very safe. Lyudmila and her students were one of the 3 tourist groups in this district. Another group was led by Lyudmila's daughter, 16-year-old Natalia. The 2 groups were planning to meet on August 5th. That's when the 2 hiking routes would intersect. It was a trip they had spent months planning and anticipating, and, as a result, the group had become more closely knit. The first 2 days of the hike went even better than expected. Overall, the route was 130 to 142 miles long and had the 3rd level of difficulty. Still, the group enjoyed their time together while climbing the slope of Retransliator Peak, working very hard and putting in lots of effort. But on August 4th, when they started their descent, the weather forecast played a bad joke on them. Instead of warm, sunny weather, the tourists got caught in a rainstorm. Since all their clothes were soaking wet, their journey slowed down due to additional weight. The teenagers were exhausted. By later calculations, by the evening of August 4th, the group had walked almost 43 miles. Lyudmila decided to set up camp in the open, even though there was tree cover nearby. The tourists approached Mount Treetrans on the slope of which they had agreed to spend the night. The group did not manage to build a fire that night, but they were still in good spirits. The following morning, August 5th, wet snow accompanied the pouring rain. But this time, the tourists could build a fire and have breakfast together. They still harbored plans of catching up with Natalia and hoped to be able to do it, taking into account how fast they had climbed the mountain the previous day. On that same day, Natalia and her groupmates got to the meeting point, but her mother never turned up. Having waited 2 days, Natalia and her group decided that her mother and the teens hadn't met the deadline. The group continued on their path, not worrying for Ludmila and the others, thinking they'd been thrown off by the bad weather. Sadly, the obstacle that appeared in the way of Korovina's group was much worse than Natalia and her group could ever imagine. The next morning, after breakfast, Ludmila and her group continued their descent, but only a few minutes after set-off, the first disaster happened. Sasha, who was walking behind everyone else, started screaming. When the others looked back, they saw him bleeding from his eyes and ears and frothing at the mouth. The guy hit the ground in a seizure and then became still. Ludmila ran up to him. She was confused and terrified. She frantically tried to make Sasha regain consciousness, but her attempts were unsuccessful. Ludmila told the rest of the group to keep walking and to call for help. The teenagers continued on their path without a clue of what was happening, but they hadn't walked too far away when they heard Ludmila's scream. Confused, the teens turned around and rushed back to Ludmila. Ludmila was sitting over Sasha's body, gushing blood from her eyes and ears and frothing at the mouth. Her symptoms were identical to Sasha's. The woman shook and then collapsed onto Sasha's body. Tatiana, one of the tourists in the group, was the closest to Sasha and Ludmila, and she immediately rushed to the hill towards the two. But before she could approach them, Tatiana grabbed her throat and started bleeding from her eyes. She fell onto the ground, still clutching at her throat, while the rest of the group froze in shock and panic. Tatiana crawled to the nearest rock and started hitting her head against it. In a couple of minutes, she was dead. A girl named Victoria and a boy named Timur got scared and ran in the opposite direction. But soon, their legs gave out, and the teenagers collapsed onto the ground. They were bleeding, grabbing at their throats, and tearing off their clothes until their bodies fell limp. Out of the tourist group of 7, only 2 remained: 17-year-old Valya and 19-year-old Dennis. Having understood they were on their own, the teenagers ran up to each other and rushed to escape the sight of their friends' deaths. But after a short time, Dennis collapsed in a seizure, and in just a few moments, his heart stopped beating. Terrified for her life, Valya escaped the horrific scene, abandoning the bodies of her friends. The only things the girl had with her were the clothes on her back and a tent. Valya ran down the mountain until she was sure she was far away from the tragedy she had just witnessed. The girl entered a forest, set up her tent for the night, and fell asleep. Having woken up, happy to still be alive, Valya immediately understood that she needed supplies if she was going to survive on her own in the wild forest. The problem was that, to get those supplies, she had to return to her friend's death scene. Knowing she had no other option, Valya returned to the mountain slope. Having reached the place, she saw that all the bodies remained motionless in their places. Valya quickly took the necessary things out of their jackets and backpacks and left, following the power lines. But the houses they led to turned out to have been abandoned. For 4 days straight, Valya followed power lines down the slope of the mountain, hoping to be found by someone. Soon the girl found the Snezhnaya River and started walking downstream. She had to spend one more night by the bank of the river and continue her search for help the next day. On August 9th, having walked for 4.3 to 4.9 miles, the exhausted girl stopped and spread out her sleeping bag on the riverside bushes. On August 10th, a group of kayakers from Kyiv noticed something in the trees as they rode down the stream of a river at the base of the Kamar-Daban Mountains. A lonely figure of a girl stood among the trees, and she was watching them. The kayakers got out of their boats, and when they approached the girl, she became hysterical, trying to tell them her story. The Ukrainians found the girl where the Snezhnaya River was joined by its tributary, Zun Sagan Chulutai. They fed her, gave her antibiotics, and took her with them. The terrified kayakers took Valya to the closest police station, where a report was filed. Many years passed before she could slowly tell the story of what happened to the other 6 people, but it was a source of shock and terror for her. Despite the police report, the official search operation did not start until August 24th. Since Valentina was not yet able to tell her version of the story, it took 2 days to find the bodies using helicopters. According to the autopsy results, all of them died of hypothermia, apart from Lyudmila, whose cause of death was a heart attack. All of them had signs of bruised lungs, and protein deficiency due to malnutrition was listed as a contributing factor to their deaths. In the end, the deaths were ruled to be accidental. All that we know about the events that happened on the Kabar-Daban mountain come from Valya's testimony. That's why, compared to her account, such a decision of the authorities is strange and central to many theories on this case. Just like with any unusual event, these theories range from aliens and the supernatural to factual, scientifically backed explanations. So, let's investigate 5 main theories that have gained the biggest popularity within the circles of those who have studied this case. It is also important to remember that some details of the incident may differ depending on the source, and each of the theories has its strong and weak points. Hypothermia and exhaustion. This is the official version recorded in the documents, but it raises a lot of questions. A histological examination of the tourist's organs and tissue were carried out in a forensic histological laboratory. There was evidence of problems with general blood circulation and breathing and pulmonary edema. Apart from that, the experts also found a protein metabolism disorder, which enabled them to state that the tourist had suffered from protein dystrophy, possibly even starvation. This evaluation and histochemical examinations fully confirmed the diagnosis: general hypothermia, which had caused the tourist's deaths. Soviet experts and doctors were adamant about this diagnosis being the correct one, but there are a few factors worth mentioning here. Firstly, the group had no starvation problems because, on that very same morning, the tourists had breakfast and set off on their path. According to Valya's testimony, the team members were calm and nobody was experiencing exhaustion or hypothermia. You'll say, yes, but maybe the teenagers were just afraid to inform the leader of their state. It's highly doubtful because, as previously mentioned, the team enjoyed close-knit ties and Lyudmila treated Sasha like her own son. So if any group member had felt bad, this concern would have been voiced. It's also noteworthy that even though the police were notified on August 10th, the search and rescue operation did not begin until August 24th. That is, the authorities waited for 2 whole weeks. That raises the question, why? It's no secret that when it still existed, the Soviet Union frantically tried to hide any incidents and catastrophes both from its citizens and the international public. The country built on totalitarianism was hiding behind the facade of perfect society. So, in this case, it's better not to trust even the conclusions of experts and doctors. For example, experts at the forensics office of Buryatia noted that when the bodies of all the dead tourists were found, they had already started decaying, and some eyeballs had been completely eaten away. Also, the report stated that 3 of the deceased, Denis, Tatiana, and Victoria, were wearing thin leotards, and Timur and Tatiana were barefoot. Sounds like too convenient an argument in favor of hypothermia. Could teenagers who had been on similar hikes before and had previous mountaineering experience possibly have worn thin leotards for such a journey? Or, even worse, decided to walk up and down a mountain barefoot? The version with Lyudmila's heart attack is also questionable. Her symptoms could indeed have been caused by a heart attack, but Lyudmila was a healthy 40-year-old woman and a master of sports of the USSR. Even if she did feel some pain, she did not mention it to anyone. And what is the likelihood of a healthy athlete suddenly dying of a heart attack? Mushroom poisoning. Lyudmila was known for her love of experimentation and testing the limits of the human body. According to this theory, it is possible that either Lyudmila herself or one of the tourists found some mushrooms and added them to their breakfast. Sadly, the mushroom species turned out to be poisonous, and the symptoms took hold during the hike, causing the tourists to experience hallucinations and nausea. What kind of mushroom could it have been? Psilocybin is the species that best matches the symptoms. For example, a typical psilocybin-induced hallucination is to see other people cry blood. Psilocybin overdoses may cause psychosis, seizures, cardiac arrest, and even coma. Valentina may have managed to survive due to having consumed a smaller dose of the mushroom, due to tolerance for it, or even a genetic predisposition to being less affected by it. She could have also been saved by the fact that she was wearing warmer clothes and escaped to the forest, sheltering from paranoia and mass hysteria. This sounds plausible enough, but this version also has its flaws. For example, take the fact that Ludmilla was an experienced master of her craft and would definitely recognize a poisonous mushroom. If one of the teenagers had found it, it's improbable that it would have been added to the food without Ludmilla's approval. Moreover, according to Valya's testimony, the group did not starve and had breakfast at daybreak, so the need for a snack of unknown mushrooms becomes questionable. They knew too much. This theory claims that the tourists could have been taking part in some Russian military experiment in the mountains and were killed for what they had seen. Later, their deaths were covered up by the police and forensic experts. According to this theory, the tourists deviated from the usual route due to bad weather, and this change of plans may have led them to a group of experimenters who were not ready for visitors. Despite this, the theory has two main problems: the spot where the tourists died and Valentina's survival. The Kamar-Daban Mountains are a very public territory that countless tourist groups constantly traverse in summer. Siberia has many opportunities for secrecy, so it would have been strange for a top-secret experiment to be carried out in a public place at the height of the tourist season. In addition, the part of the mountain where the group members died was an open area visible from the air and higher ground. It would not have made sense for a top-secret mission worth killing people over to be happening in this part of the Kamar-Daban Mountains, even if we accept the possibility of it happening in that mountain range. Then there's Valya. Why did she survive? Why was she spared? If she was forced to lie about what had happened, she definitely did not help clear the suspicion surrounding the incident. And if she was forced to keep it secret, then why was her story so wild? This is the main problem of the military experiment theory. Nevertheless, a similar theory suggests that certain chemical experiments or chemical weapons trials might have been happening at this site. That's why the officials did not hurry to the scene of the event, waiting for 2 weeks until the concentration of poison in the air would drop. But still, it's tough both to deny and to confirm this theory. Contaminated water. This theory also relies on the rain bringing toxins down, but it suggests that the tourists consumed toxins from their water. Lake Baikal, situated in high altitudes, is a known dump of toxic waste. If this waste matter had been washed downstream into their water, the tourists could have consumed deadly toxins with their breakfast. The contaminant might even have been one of those water-soluble nerve agents with properties that resemble mushrooms. Maybe Valentina survived because she drank less or took her water from a different location than the other tourists. Most highly toxic substances start taking effect in a few minutes. That's why all the hikers died later. The problem with this theory is that the deaths were a singular event. If a source of water used by many tourists was contaminated to such an extent, then it doesn't make sense for only one group to have been affected by it. Valya's memories are inaccurate. The experience of living through trauma is often reflected in the way we remember those events, especially if the survivor only tells it many years later, as in Valya's case. It's noteworthy that since Valya is the only source of information, she could very well exaggerate something, or, inversely, let something slip from her attention. There's no need to blame her for this. Studies on the inaccuracy of eyewitness testimony show that such situations happen very often. It is quite likely that the tourist did die, just as the autopsy report states. Since that night, the tourists were not properly sheltered, and the group died together due to hypothermia. Valya might have survived because she had chosen to wear different clothes or had a different level of physical training. It is also necessary to add that people who die of hypothermia often experience paradoxical undressing, a phenomenon common in some cases of lethal hypothermia, when the patients, despite the low temperature of the environment, paradoxically take off their clothes due to an unexpected sensation of warmth. It would be a realistic explanation for the fact that the tourists were found partly undressed. This theory can stand alone or be applied to other ideas where there seem to be gaps or incoherences in some parts of the testimony. Indeed, none of these theories provide a full explanation for the incident. This tragedy can remain a mystery forever, and the families of the tourists may never be able to learn the truth. We can only hope that in the future, when technology becomes more advanced, we will be able to find the answers to this question. Hopefully, we've shed some light on these mysterious events. If you've liked this video, hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and you will be the first to learn the clue to the Kamar Daban mountain range incident as soon as we have the answers.